All right, by my clock, we're at 12:34, so we'll go and get started. My name is Jamil Jaffer. I'm the founder and executive director of the National Security Institute at George Mason's Antonin Scalia Law School. I'm glad to be co-hosting this webinar today with the Aerospace Corporation, a great partner, and with some great friends here today with us. We have Joshua Huminski, an NSI visiting fellow and director of the Mike Rogers Center for Intelligence and Global Affairs. We have Karen L. Jones, senior project leader at the Center for Space Policy and Strategy at the Aerospace Corporation, and Dr. Jamie M. Marin, the executive director of the Center for Space Policy and Strategy, also at the Aerospace Corporation. So we're excited about the conversation today. We're going to be talking about commercial space and national security space, the intersection between the two, how the two go together. What we're going to do is we're going to do about 45 minutes of conversation between me and the panelists, some questions that we've been thinking through. And then we're going to turn it over to the audience. And if you want to go ahead and ask some questions, please put your questions in the Q&A function down below. We'll get through as many of them as we can. And so that'll be right around the 1 o'clock, 1:10 part of the hour. So go ahead and put your questions in along the way as you're asking them, and we'll hop in and we'll get some of those in too. So thanks everybody for coming. I want to jump right in, if I might. And maybe we'll start with Jamie, right? Why are we talking about reforming the space industry now? What are the global events? What global events are driving us today to rethink the space enterprise?
So we're at a really interesting time in space right now. It's a challenging time, but also a time that's absolutely full of opportunity. For national security space in particular, there's a significant growth in sense of threat in the international environment. Competition with Russia and China is, I think, more acute, and they've taken some technological steps that are, I think, correctly viewed as threatening to U.S. space capabilities. In the civil area, there's a lot of energy and excitement surrounding exploration opportunities and some important steps being taken on scientific progress as well. We've got some extraordinarily ambitious goals that the administration has laid out that, may be beyond attainable, but are driving a lot of activity and hopefully positive progress. On the commercial side, we have a great deal of energy, even in this post-COVID-19 environment, still a great deal of investment going on, less than previous year, but still quite significant, and a lot of exploration of potential new business models and new ways of exploiting space-based data in particular. That's quite exciting. So there's a lot going on. It's threat and opportunity, but it does necessitate rethinking some of our approaches to sort of fundamental topics like, how does the government procure space capability? How does the government interrelate with the private sector? What does international partnership look like? To what degree are we willing to embrace interdependence, not just arm's length partnership? Those are all big issues in a democratized space environment where there's many more players of significance.
Yeah. Now, Karen, you recently wrote a paper about this very issue and about this overlap between commercial space and national security space. Tell us how that plays into the environment that Jamie just talked to us about. Give us a sense of what you told us in that paper and what the really important takeaways are for this intersection, particularly the current environment and the current economic environment that we're in today.
So the paper is called Continuous Production Agility, Adapting at the Speed of Relevance. And it's based upon our corporate thought leaders involved in addressing some of the issues that Jamie just brought up. How can we be agile? How can we meet the threats for today and be more resilient, to be more adaptive? So we pulled together a team, this was back in 2018, to discuss how are we going to do this? How are we going to future-proof the space enterprise?
Right.
And CPA itself, Continuous Production Agility, is an approach in which resiliency does not come from picking one optimal future architecture. Instead, it comes from the ability to adapt the architecture and scale to future needs in an affordable way. And adaptability and scalability are goals in and of themselves because it gets us to where we need to be, along with the more traditional goals of resilience.
Right.
And
so sort of the opposite, though, historically, of where we've come, right? We've always thought about sort of one constellation, very resilient, right? Sticks it out up there for years and years and years, and high cost, you know, and this is sort of the opposite concept. Is that right, Karen?
It is. And we say in the paper that, you know, there's different answers for different time periods. And in that sense, you know, a highly customized, exquisite system was good for the time for certain types of threats.
Right.
But today is different. And you will see in this paper a lot of lessons learned, harvested, and we'll talk about this later, from the commercial sector. We didn't make a lot of this up, but if you look at modular architectures in the commercial world, you'll see some of these basic tenets.
Right. And Joshua, you recently wrote an op-ed calling for government industry leaders to come together and to treat the space enterprise as a single ecosystem. Help us understand why it's important to bridge that gap between government and commercial space, and how can we sort of achieve this sort of reframing that you've laid out?
Thank you. I think the biggest challenge we're facing right now, and I completely agree with Jamie and Karen's perspectives on this, is you've had a structure and system that has built up over time that's incentivized to a very requirements-driven acquisition process. The government for the very long time had the monopoly over, you know, the bright ideas, if you will, that their capabilities were so special and so unique that there was only one customer and one provider, and that's basically the defense industrial base responding to government requirements. And as Jamie outlined at the outset, you have a change in the threat environment, but you also have a change in the opportunity environment. And then what we're seeing is, while those two have changed, the process by which we get things into the national security space architecture and that space ecosystem has not changed. So it's very much the government, for the sake of argument, be it the Air Force or Space Force, says, I need X. And then the defense industrial base says, hey, here is X. That worked up until now, where you have, you know, SpaceX, Blue Origin, Rocket Lab, NanoRex, all these companies that are out there that are innovating faster than the government can wrap their heads around it, and coming up with ideas that the government never would have thought about in the first place. So there's a delta between that capability and the ingest for it. And so what, under Chairman Rogers' leadership and Representative Nye's leadership, what we looked at is, how do we integrate those commercial capabilities? And our approach was fundamentally not to define winners and losers, not to say that this is what we want. It was to say, this is where we want to be. These are the capabilities we want to ingest into the system. Right. So rather than saying, I need a coffee cup, I need a mechanism to deliver caffeine as effectively as possible. Okay, commercial sector, go out and provide that for me. And so it's a shift from a requirements-based model to a capabilities-based model, concomitant with an idea of where do we want to be in the future, and let's build back from there, as opposed to just constantly responding to the situation.
Yeah, but so Joshua, this all makes sense to me, but, you know, I mean, this is, and both what you and Karen are laying out are fundamentally different ways of thinking about how the government does its business and how it's done the business for, you know, 40 years, 50 years, you know. Help us understand how, I'm interested in your, and I want to come back to Karen, I want to understand though, how in your sort of environment, can you really get the government to ingest new capabilities? I mean, the government's a big bureaucracy. How, the DOD, I mean, even more agile parts of the government, right? Whether it's the intelligence community or the like, I mean, is, you know, it's big buying, right? They've got these exquisite requirements, and, you know, they've got programs of record that have been running for decades, and we're making changes at the margin. How can you possibly get them to ingest these new ideas and new capabilities, and then contract for them in a way that that is both effective at getting the outcome, but also, you know, there's been a lot of time about the need to maintain that space industrial base, right? Is that still a thing today?
I think it is, and you're absolutely right. You're talking about moving and shifting organization that is, you know, for want of a better phrase, sclerotic. It is slow. It is obsessed with process, is obsessed with bureaucracy and mission assurance, and it is very fundamentally risk averse. And so I think now you're at an inflection point with the stand-up of the Space Force. You're at an inflection point with Space Command being reestablished and the National Space Council. You're seeing an attitude that the culture needs to change. There needs to be a more forward-leaning, aggressive, adaptive, risk-taking, smart risk-taking culture, so that you fail forward or you learn from your failures. Before, you had the environment where you're putting $1 billion satellite up on a $500 million rocket, that thing cannot fail. But if I have a distributed architecture, a modular architecture, which is Karen writes about, if I'm using CubeSats, smaller satellites that are $100,000, $200,000, for me personally, that'd be a very expensive loss. But for the United States government, that's less than a rounding error. So you're seeing this change where you have the commercial companies driving forward, leading the way to do, hosted payload, dedicated small launch like you have with Rocket Lab, or reusable rockets like SpaceX. They've fundamentally changed the architecture and the way that we can do things. And the government's slowly starting to see this. So they're looking at the Space Enterprise Consortium, getting small space companies together to bid on contracts that hitherto have not done so before. Defense Innovation Unit is doing small seed contracts. The NRO is starting like a small seed contract. So on the periphery, you're starting to see this adaptation and change. And with this new opportunity for the stand-up of the service, I think you potentially, touch wood proverbial, you can see a real change in that culture. And hopefully this is an opportunity to get it right going forward. Because if we continue the same models and the way that we've done business for the last 15, 20 years in space, China and Russia are just going to take off and leave us behind.
Yeah, so Karen, what about that? I mean, how can we think about this this challenge to the government's way of thinking, right? I mean, Joshua seems to say, look, this is a real thing. We can totally do this, right? I mean, it's happening at the margins right now, but eventually we'll be able to do this on some of the big programs of record, right? And worry less about exquisite capabilities and talk about rapid refresh and put the latest, capabilities out there. Is that, I mean, it sounds really awesome, but it also sounds really hard to do, even with Space Force and the former leadership of Heather Wilson, Secretary of Air Force. I mean, this just seems really hard to do.
Well, it's a challenge, but it's something where I think we can take this on. Beyond CPA, continuous production agility, which focused on steady flow production, the larger theme that aerospace thought leaders developed is something called Project Thor. I think of Chris Hemsworth, but it's also about agile enterprise, modern enterprise systems engineering, digital engineering, and DevSecOps and cybersecurity methodologies for plug and play. It's really about what the commercial industry is calling 4.0, Industry 4.0. Okay, so you have that type of modern enterprise digital engineering framework for agility. And then you advance architectures in a meaningful kind of prototyping way. That's another leg of the four-legged table here. And the third is streamlined decision-making. This is where you get, Jamil, into what you're referring to as culture changing, but decision-making on requirements, resources, and more aggressive speed targets as far as acquisitions and decision authorities. And the fourth leg of the table is CPA itself, which focuses a lot on launch on schedule rather than launch on need. All those things, and we separated them so they're, you can start to address them. Together, that will create the transformation that's necessary in order for us to be agile enough to meet the threats.
So Jamie,
I think it's important to note this is this has some characteristics of like a portfolio approach. I mean, there's clearly going to be some mission areas where development timelines are going to be long because the nation is asking for the systems to do things that are unprecedented. Right. And in those areas, you're going to have to, make that conscious choice up front, right? We really want to push frontiers. This is something that is uniquely governmental. Commercial industry is not going to do it on its own. Mission areas like missile warning, right? There's not a large market for infrared tracking from space in the commercial sector. Now, maybe there's some future use case there, but we haven't seen that yet. So those kinds of areas you're going to see on one end of a spectrum, whereas areas that are heavily influenced and shaped by commercially developed technology will slide to the other. The other piece of this is we've got to think through a new concept of risk. So it's not so much that you abandon the notion of wanting things to work, which is what we call mission assurance in the space sector. It's that you almost move to mission assurance where mission has a capital M, and that's the end to end, right? Because getting through a successful launch and having a satellite check out on orbit, that in and of itself doesn't actually deliver the end mission. Yeah. The end mission is are you providing the capabilities to the users on the ground, whether they're civilian or military, scientific or national security? And for the national security stuff, it's, are you doing it even when an adversary is messing with you?
Right.
Right. And so your greatest risk may no longer be self-inflicted.
Right.
You know, we have a long history of blowing things up accidentally that we've mostly beat, but you never can take your eye off the ball. But that may no longer be your greatest risk. Yeah. Your greatest risk may be that in the moment of need, you built something vulnerable. And in some cases, you can address that with proliferation. But in other cases, you're going to have to really think through what is the weakest link that the adversary will find, and how can you protect that?
Right. So, but let's talk about how all of this contributes to the question of the defense industrial base, right, or the space industrial base, as it were, right? One of the things that we've spent a lot of time thinking through as a national security community, and the government has, is how do we keep the industrial base when it comes to space alive, right? And how do we keep it surviving through the lean times? How do we keep those capabilities here domestically? And do we have to award these long lead contracts, not just because they take a long time to build, but because we need to keep the industrial base healthy, right? Is that less of a problem today? Josh, I want to hear your thoughts on this. Is that less of a problem today because we've got all these commercial space companies up and running and doing stuff for not just the government? Or is it still the case that we really do need sort of government financing and government long lead procurement and government sort of feeding the beast in order to keep some of these companies alive? I know that just recently, as part of the COVID-19 recovery effort, DoD gave guaranteed firm fixed price, no bid contracts to a number of small launch providers to ensure they have that launch capability and maintain it over time. Is that something we need to continue to worry about in your mind?
I think the space industrial base has fundamentally shifted from what it once was to what it is today. And it would be a misnomer to say that the commercial space industry can live completely autonomously, independently of US government support, be it via contracts, financing, or some other mechanism. What needs to happen is, to Jamie's point, there is a spectrum on which these capabilities live. There are the very low ends, low-hanging fruit of communications or imagery like planets, where they can be satisfied to some degree with commercial capabilities. And at the other end, there is that nuclear early warning and command and control. That is truly a inherently governmental role and responsibility for which there will be no commercial customer. What the government needs to shift its mentality is being the customer to being a customer, with it in the back of the mind that there may come a time when it is a lean time or there are problems that they do need to step in and be more of a customer. But the reality is, as we're shifting, I'd like to see, as we are shifting to a truly space economy, the government can become one of those customers. There are some things that the defense industrial base is going to be, the big ones, the Boeings, the Lockheeds of the world are going to be the only providers that those truly bespoke, high-end NRO level capabilities, you're not going to find a commercial customer base for. And that's fine, and that's okay. But where the government should be shifting is to defining the capabilities and going to the market and saying, can we do this here? Yeah. Can we find a solution that's going to meet our needs further out rather than picking winners and losers? Invest in the ecosystem, invest in a number of companies and see what succeeds. I mean, taking other models like the NQTEL or the DARPAs or the IARPAs of the world, where they're finding solutions, they're finding capabilities, they're funding ideas that may fail. And that's okay. Whereas before the structure was incentivized, and this doesn't include just the industrial base and the government, but we're looking at FFRDCs in particular as well, they're incentivized to have government largesse. We need to change that. We need to incentivize the commercial sector and incentivize the government to go to an approach that pushes things to the commercial market and takes advantage of it to a greater degree than it does today. And that means participating more so in that ecosystem.
Yeah, so Karen, I mean, is this a realistic way to go about things? I mean, it's obviously going to be challenging to some of these longer standing providers, right, of capabilities. And they're used to getting these government contracts. Do we worry that that some of that will decay, and even though it might be replaced in part by commercial space, right? Commercial space may not be a complete solution because as you and Joshua and Jamie have all laid out, right, there are certain things the government's going to exclusively need, and there may not be a commercial market for infrared detection from space at the relevant capacity the government needs to do it at. And so, do we worry that as we go to this more sort of agile structure who could doubt it seems self-evidently better, right? Do we worry that that's going to cause some weakness in core parts of the national security industrial base that will be made up for by commercial? And if so, how do we deal with that concern?
Well, there's always concern that, the industrial base and space, there are certain fragile providers that have highly specialized products. But if we do this right, and if we roll this out right, I think it can be a win-win on all sides. The beauty of modular architecture is that the ecosystem of tier 2s and tier 3s are building to a certain interface that reduces their NRE significantly. You add on top of that a predictable tempo for launch, and they can start to see, aha, we're not behaving like that in the past. It was, just look at the recapitalization rates and you'll see these giant vacillations. It's called the bullwhip effect. Economists refer to it as that, or demand amplification. The customer moves this much, and at the end of the supply chain, people are going nuts, either reducing their spending or increasing it. So creating a stable, more predictable type of demand for these suppliers is very, very important. Combine that with the cost savings for modular architecture, and I think you have something. And again, this is something where we can take our cues from the commercial world. Look at Nokia. Back in 2008, it was the leader. I had my Nokia phone. And within 1 year, everything flip-flopped, and you had Android and iPhone using what is essentially a modular platform, and a developed ecosystem of app providers come in and replace Nokia. And it was a very interesting time to see such a huge change. And they did it because they nurtured these app developers. They gave them an open enough system and predictability with what that modular platform looked like to innovate on top of that.
Right, that makes sense. Now, Jamie, how does an FFRDC like Aerospace Corporation drive these kind of new solutions in the space industry and sort of deal with both the problems of today, but also the problems of tomorrow? How do FFRDCs play into this role?
Yeah, I mean, so, and for the benefit of our diverse audience, Aerospace is an organization that the U.S. government created in the early days of the space age to be their technical advisor. It was set up as a nonprofit without conflicts of interest, so that we can kind of tell the government what looks to be working, what doesn't look to be working, and we're expressly prohibited from competing with industry. We're there to kind of grade the sheet and provide the private advice without being caught up in the different economic interests. But that doesn't mean we can be blind to economic changes and industry changes. And we've got to be capable of sensing those and helping the government think their way through this. The Project Thor effort that Karen was talking about that led to this continuous production agility recommendation was an explicitly defense-oriented task. It came from the Deputy Secretary of Defense at the time to our leadership team, and he was really looking at these changes and looking at the need to significantly accelerate the U.S. defense and, to a lesser extent, national security space cycle time in terms of the competitive environment.
Right.
And so he said, he was saying, help us think through ways to get out of this dilemma that we want exquisite things which require long timelines, which mean that an adversary seeking to counter our capabilities can outpace us. And can build those counters faster than we can build the next exquisite. It's a really good question to pose. And, again, some people read these papers that we've published and look at the private advice we've given to the government on this and say, this is all about small and fast. And that's not really a fair reading. It's really about this portfolio and recognizing where you can go small and fast, where you may still have to go big, but you can do it faster by changing key components of what you buy. Karen's point about modularity and standardized interfaces, and also how you buy it, the processes you employ. And it's the combination of that that's key. You're not going to achieve the kinds of cycle times that Department of Defense leadership was interested in achieving by just changing what you buy or by just changing how you buy it.
Right.
You have to come at both parts if you're going to achieve, we're talking major changes.
Right. That makes sense. So Joshua, what kind of new relationships and investments are needed, particularly in the national security space arena, to sort of do what Jamie and Karen have just described, to sort of implement this portfolio approach where you do have some of sort of the classic, build the big thing and put it up there and sort of a single thing or a single constellation. What do we need to do in industry to sort of allow it to do both these things and service this diverse set of needs the government has?
I think there's a couple things. I mean, for one, I think one of the key components that Jamie alluded to earlier on is that you need to define what it is you want to achieve and where you want to be. And under Chairman Rogers' leadership and Representative Nye's leadership, we started looking at building from the right, defining where we wanted to be in 5, 10, 15 years, what we wanted to have in terms of capabilities, be it reconstitution, lost asset replacement, and then building backwards from there. And I think until recently, we've been very much looking at the other way around, as here's a nifty capability, what can we do with it? We need to start defining, okay, what is the adversary going to do and where do we want to be and how do we want to respond to the adversary's position? In terms of what the government needs to do in terms of the relationships with the commercial partners is they need to break the monopoly and mentality of the defense industrial base and the big organizations that exist out there and looking at the bigger ecosystem. And a number of the roundtables that we held, it was amazing to see when you had individuals from a commercial sector, from small companies in many cases, sitting next to their government counterparts, and you'd have the commercial companies say, hey, we're doing X, Y, or Z. And the government counterpart goes, really? You're doing that? That's very interesting. I had no idea. And it's getting outside of that mentality, outside of the Beltway in particular, outside of that really core component around SMC in LA, and looking out there and seeing what's out there, seeing what these companies are doing and the capabilities that they're offering. So it's broadening the aperture to realizing that you have a commercial partner out there that isn't necessarily one of the bigs. And the bigs are doing great work. Let's not make any mistake about that. But it's to realize that there are other opportunities out there. There are other capabilities that are being put onto orbit, and looking at that broader ecosystem that we talk about. If you only have one or two predators in an ecosystem, it's going to die out. You need a very healthy and diverse ecosystem. That doesn't mean you're picking winners and losers. It means you're seeding it in such a way that you're allowing competition, the best to rise within a view of this is where I want to get to. Air Force Space Command did a paper, it was Space Futures 2060, where they looked at, what could the future in 2060 look like, and where do we need to get come get there from today? And that's the kind of mentality you need to think about, is what do we want to truly be able to do on orbit, and then build backwards.
Right. Now, I think that makes a lot of sense. So Karen, given what Joshua just said, and Jamie's idea of this portfolio approach that I know that you talked about too in your CPA paper, we've been hearing a lot about this importance of public-private partnerships, right? Tell us what that has to do with any of this. I mean, clearly the government's a buyer, right? So got that. Clearly we got commercial space, so they're a seller, right? But what is this, what we always talk about public-private partnerships, what is the relevance in this context?
Well, Josh mentioned the need for a healthy ecosystem. And as part of a healthy ecosystem, I think a government sponsor, a stakeholder, should consider under certain conditions public-private partnerships. And before I get into that, I just want to mention that that term, public-private partnerships, is confusing. It's a term where you have risk sharing between a public sponsor and private sector, and there's a lot of shades of gray in between, what's fully public or fully private. But I think there's a lot of opportunity here, and the US typically has been behind Europe in terms of public-private partnerships, primarily because we've had this robust municipal bond market for low interest loans, et cetera. In Europe, you have these things called private finance initiatives. We're also going to learn from Europe's mistakes, which is they've often used PFIs or public-private partnerships to hide debt. That's not one of the reasons we want to use this, but typically a government sponsor should consider a public-private partnership, or P3, if they want efficiency gains, if they want to reduce overall life cycle costs. That's also referred to as the value for money. If they want to transfer risk to the private sector, those are the key three primary means. But within the space sector, it could also be spinning in technologies and bringing new innovations to bear on something that has primarily been part of the government sector. More innovation is going going on in the private sector now.
Right.
Also, perhaps we want to promote a more robust commercial industry. So again, we would want to align a P3 with some policy goals, such as, commercial launch, for instance.
Right.
So those are the key reasons to move towards a P3. And it must be a win-win. I've heard before, oh, well, the commercial sector could profit from this. That's the whole point. It should be a win-win. Reduce risk on the part of the government and increase schedule efficiency or cost efficiency, and to create this robust, healthy commercial sector and let them profit. Finding that win-win. And we have a paper that CSPS wrote a couple of years ago, which you can read, which discusses this, but there's a lot of key tenets to that, one of which you need complete transparency and accountability.
Right.
But if a P3 is done correctly, it can add a lot to our ongoing innovation in the space sector and for our government customers.
Yeah.
If I can add a quick shameless plug, we'll be airing a webinar tomorrow in which I talk with former NASA Administrator Charlie Bolden about the rise of the commercial cargo and commercial crew programs, which are, of course, public-private partnerships NASA did that will, I think, go down as having dramatically fostered the growth of the private launch industry in the United States. SpaceX likely would not have made it without that government contract and that prospect of future business. And also, in the end, I think it will be shown to have delivered capability to the government at a reduced cost and roughly comparable schedule to what they likely would have achieved through a more traditional acquisition. Yeah. So, a significant success there that was achieved over the last decade and a little bit more.
Speaking of that question, Jamie, I'm interested, and by the way, I want to mention to the audience, we will be turning to your questions here in just about 2 or 3 minutes. And so I see a couple of people put their questions in. I see somebody with their hand up. If you would just put your questions in the Q&A box, we'll get to those here in just a few minutes. But Jamie, on this question of, the economic environment, and, Karen was just talking about public-private partnerships, we're obviously in a very challenging economic situation with COVID and the potential bankruptcies coming about, a lot of people being laid off. Should we be worried about the health of the space industrial base in this particular environment, given just the economic challenge we're seeing? I mean, the government obviously is a longtime buyer. Can the government sustain the breadth and scope of the current space industrial base as commercially focused as it is in this environment?
So we should be concerned about the future of the American economy. It's a pretty ugly situation out there, and unfortunately, the trends with the virus are looking very negative, and so in the U.S., so this is not over. The space industry is absolutely affected. There have been a couple of really noticeable areas. There were some parts and logistics issues early on. There were some capital access issues early on. Some of which were loosely tied to COVID. The OneWeb bankruptcy, for example, I think was probably overdetermined. COVID certainly didn't make the situation easier for them, but their access to capital from a key financer was, challenged already. I think the big picture, the space industry is performing better than many other sectors. If you're operating in a clean room to do your building of your equipment, you're already taking significant steps that we would recognize as social distancing and purification. And lots of the space industry is really about the flow of data, not the flow of people. So it's in some respects more robust. And the fact that the government is the critical buyer still in the space industry gives them some degree of insulation. That doesn't mean it's easy, right? That doesn't mean that they don't have challenges. There's significant challenges, but I would rather be in the space industry right now than, say, operating a movie theater or running a a restaurant.
Right.
Across the economy, it's a relatively secure area.
Yeah, makes sense. So I said we would turn to questions from the audience, so we'll start with the first question. What evidence is there that China, and anybody should jump in, what evidence is there that China, and particularly Russia, are actually better poised to exploit commercial space for national security than the U.S.? And the question refers to the fused government-commercial Chinese system is clearly much more of a threat in this area than Russia is, but the Chinese don't seem particularly innovative or world market leaders in these particular areas. So thoughts on that, Karen? Why don't I turn to you? Any thoughts on that question?
Well, they are adversaries, and this is one of the reasons why we want to stay ahead with agility. So regardless as to how the threat morphs, we can future-proof our space system and address it with innovative new payloads that may come about. So I don't think we've lost our edge to our adversaries by any means, but there are more competitors in the space environment, more than just Russia and China, and that is kind of the basis for why we're moving towards more of an agile stance, because who knows what the next threat beyond Russia or China might be, and we'll be ready for it with a modular agile system.
Right. I think that makes sense.
Okay, Jamil, I think there's two parts to this here. Looking at the way that the Chinese are pursuing private space, commercial space in particular, there is a significant danger in the commoditization of space capabilities. There are a number of commercial capabilities in China that are looking at doing reusable rockets, doing small launch, offering cheap discount rocket launches, and then also moving to the payloads and also moving to the orbital architectures and whatnot. And if you are a non-Western country, the attractiveness of a cheaper launch from China may start to outweigh your concern about national security components and risks.
It's like a Huawei router.
Problem. I'm sorry?
Like a Huawei router, right?
Exactly. You're seeing the Huaweiification of space, for want of a better phrase, and that is a serious concern for the space industrial base for the United States. And that's where we're starting to looking at smart space industrial base policy. And on the flip side, looking at the national security component, the United States defined the scope, pace, and effectiveness of space for since the space age dawned. Certainly Russia during the Cold War could do certainly anti-space capabilities and counter-space capabilities, but it was largely a benign sanctuary environment in which the United States could do whatever it wanted, whenever it wanted. That no longer exists. China, Russia, our adversaries know where our gold-plated school bus architectures are. If they wanted to hit a SBIR satellite, they could hit a SBIR satellite. That's where we need to go to this changed mentality and model of let's disaggregate the architectures, let's distribute it, let's go to a modular component, let's do a mega constellation. I would much prefer to have a Project Kuiper or a Starlink constellation that has a number of nifty IR sensors, synthetic aperture radar sensors, distributed across a 5,000 ball constellation, that if China takes a pot shot and hits a dozen of them, that's annoying stop versus it's a critical national security existential threat. And so I think those are the two trends that speak specifically to China and Russia. On the China component, it is the commercial space sector that they are innovating and driving towards. And on the security side, it is both Russia and China. We've set the standard, and now they can just take pot shots if they were to do so.
Well, let me ask Jamie about that. So on this point that Joshua just raised, obviously we know, without getting into any classified information, we know that our enemies are, and in particular Russia and China, are developing counter space capabilities, right? And this is a threat to not just the U.S.'s national security space systems, but to our commercial space systems also. How concerned should we be about the counter space threat? And is modularity and replaceability and resilience the answer? Because it's not just the ability to sort of take your satellite out, as you point out, Jamie, earlier. It's the ability to, when you want to look, to not be able to look, right? And how do we deal with that question?
Yeah, so it's an extraordinarily complicated question, and it's one where it's a cat and mouse game, right? Both sides are playing. I think it's a little of a misnomer to say this is actually new. Yeah. We had a short period where it was quiescent, but of course the US and the Soviets both tested anti-satellite weapons in the Cold War. There was a broad expectation that we would have engagement up to the level of nuclear detonation in space in the event of a U.S.-Soviet conflict.
Right.
I mean, this is
in order to knock out satellites.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. If you think back to the debates of the 80s and early 90s about the Milstar nuclear command and control communications satellite system, right? It was characterized in the Congress and in political debates as a Battlestar Galactica hardened against even nuclear detonation. And by the way, yes, because we were thinking,
right,
we might have to be able to communicate with our forces in an environment where the adversary was doing it.
Right.
So this is not it's not a completely new thing, but what we're really thinking about now is this notion that conflict and direct engagement with space assets could be part of even fairly middle range conflict.
Right. It might just be part of the standard operating procedure in a small conflict.
Yeah, and that's a key step. It's a democratized issue, right? I mean, the Iraqis deployed GPS jammers during the Second Gulf War.
Right.
Every significant adversary should be expected to deploy some sort of counter space. Now, it may not be a missile launching into geosynchronous orbit to take out a satellite. That's a heavy lift for all but the largest powers.
Yeah.
There was a couple of reports that were put out by the National Air and Space Intelligence Center and the Defense Intelligence Agency about a year and a half ago at an unclassified level, and available to the public now, that really lay out the whole range of potential counter space activity that we have to hope that adversaries don't pursue, but be prepared in case they do.
Right.
And so that's jammers, that's directed energy, lasers and microwave type weapons, that's direct descent missiles, that's co-orbital satellites that are designed to smash into or otherwise engage ours. And those are that's a range of threats, and different things respond to different ones, right? If you have thousands of satellites on orbit, it's really inefficient for an adversary to shoot a bunch of conventional missiles at them.
Yeah.
But that might not be the only way they could engage.
Sure.
If that's a communications satellite, they might be able to jam each of those 1,000 satellites as they come over and defeat its effect. So you really have to think through the whole end to end of what is the mission that we are seeking to achieve with these satellites, down to the user on the ground or in the air or at sea that's depending on it, and what can the adversary do to break the effectiveness of our system. It's not just about blowing stuff up. It's about that end to end.
And Karen,
I agree with Jimmy, obviously. That's the war-fighting domain. I think the key component is, I was trying to say, is that space is now a war-fighting domain, which is that public acknowledgement that's happened within the last few years is driving a lot of the attitudinal and cultural change, which is leading to Space Force's creation and Space Command's reestablishment and what have you. So certainly it was a component, obviously, in the 80s, the 90s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, but now we're starting to see a public awareness communications efforts by now the Space Force and previously the Air Force to define that as saying space is a warfighting domain now, and we need to orient ourselves towards that.
Well, so Karen, is this a problem that we're looking at space as a warfighting domain, even though it may have always sort of been that way since we've been testing ASAT weapons for 3 decades? Is it a concern that now that we're sort of quote unquote militarizing space, and if so, is there a way out of sort of a space arms race, or are we just sort of doomed to that, and that's just the next step? Jamie already referred to this idea of direct descent weapons. We talked about jamming. We talked about potential on-orbit capabilities, whether that's knock it out or do something else. I mean, this is a serious set of concerns, particularly when you think about the fragility of some of our constellations. Let's talk about the public ones, GPS, right? I mean, it's no secret how challenged that constellation is. Should we be concerned about this militarization trend when it comes to space?
I think so. And you could flip this and say, space can be a tool for peace. For instance, if you had enough open data and open data sharing on Earth observation, whether it's looking at the collapse of the South China Sea and the illegal fishing going on there, the polar ice caps melting, and other types of eco disasters and humanitarian disasters. And if we could share that information with transparency comes accountability. And with accountability, you can name and shame the bad people.
Right.
And I think we have to remember that space is absolutely something that can be used for peaceful purposes. So I'm trying to remain optimistic on that note, and I hope we move in that direction more and more so, especially as we're facing this very significant climate crisis.
Yeah, yeah. So we have another question from the audience. Actually, this is kind of a funny one. So, in the topic of our talk today, we described the need for national security and commercial space to have a unified theory of everything. I don't remember whose idea that topic was, but the questioner wants to know is, what is that unified theory of everything advertised in the program title? And is it sort of the classic Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy? Is it a number? What is our unified theory of everything we're talking about in that? Whoever wants to take that one.
The answer is 42. Was that the number in the?
I can't remember if it was 42 or 43. It was 42, wasn't it?
Yeah.
42.
There you go. So who came up with that title? Anybody want to take a shot at that, or should we skip that question?
I think I'll take a stab at it. It's less of a specifically defined theory, y equals mx plus b. It's more of a change in the mentality and approach that we look at space and national security space in particular. We need to look at it as a whole of government and a whole of nation approach. A whole of government approach goes beyond the interagency process to where you have the Space Force now sitting at the center possibly of a broader ecosystem of NASA, NOAA, Treasury, State, Transportation, where you have all these individual silos need to merge together because there are so many interdependencies on and through space. So that's the one component. But then on the other hand, you have the whole of nation approach. And that's where I think we start talking about that commercial space, the defense industrial base, the government partnerships, academia, the FFRDCs, again, breaking out of that silo mentality and realizing that there is cross-pollination, there is cooperation that needs to happen. If we continue to look at space in isolation, either a domain, be it warfighting or not, as a zone of economic activity, as a place for peaceful operations, if we look at these in silos, we are going to fundamentally lose the competitive advantage that the United States enjoys today. We need to take advantage of the strengths of every single one of these components and recognizing that, hey, if I want to launch faster, that means I need to change the launch licensing requirements. Right. If I want to do X in space, I need to change the way that I start looking at export regulations and to work with our allies in the United Kingdom, Germany, and Canada. If I want to establish norms of behavior and rules in space, I need to have a presence at the United Nations, also through the Department of State and at these international bodies. So it's changing the mentality where we've seen everything in myopic, narrow focus, where it's military, it is civilian, it is commercial, it is scientific. We need to start looking at everything together. And I think that's where you can say that that's the grand unified theory of space.
Interesting. Karen, thoughts?
Well, I'm thinking in terms of the global economy. And getting back to what our adversaries might be up to, Ellen Lorne mentioned, who's our chief acquisition executive at the DoD, that we are vulnerable to adversarial capital. So as you think about the fire sale that might occur with OneWeb, as you think about some of these other companies folding, who will pick them up?
Yeah. And
how will the global economy kind of take that into account? And how can the DoD and how can the US ensure that we're not vulnerable to this very opportunistic time right now?
Yeah. So talk to us about that. I think that's a really interesting and important point. Like, this is a real concern, right? We have a trusted capital initiative at the DoD, but how do we avoid this problem of a company goes bankrupt, right? There may be CFIUS, right, implications of the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, right? But even if CFIUS rejects an investment, that may just mean the company collapses, that IP lays on the table, right? And then somebody else picks it up along the way. Why is there a way to really stoke American innovation to acquire that and keep it here and keep it alive? Because it's not seeming like there are a lot of good options for that right now, even particularly in this environment.
Well, I think if you're looking at companies that were already weak pre-COVID and were already suffering, whose balance sheets didn't look good before, they're not going to look good now. So I think looking at what we can save and examining some financial levers across these companies, whether it's, you know, using the Defense Production Act, which is a relic of World War II, which is invoked more and more quite now. Jamil, I know you're very interested in that topic. Or it could be low interest loans. It could be grants. There's a lot of financial levers that the US government can pull for those companies that are viable. And that part's very important. Which companies are viable, which have markets, which are worth, you know, saving during this very vulnerable time.
Yeah, and that's a really important point. Jamie, thoughts on that?
Well, I think I'm reminded a bit of Olympic diving here. You know, you get points for the quality of your dive multiplied by points for your degree of difficulty. And the degree of difficulty of the dive that Joshua's identified is pretty high. His op-ed from you know, about a month ago does a nice job of laying out the path to a whole of government or whole of nation approach. It is, you know, I sat in on a number of sessions when I was acting as Undersecretary of the Air Force, when we were working on collaboration between Air Force on space, National Reconnaissance Office, NASA, NOAA, and the degree of difficulty of those collaborative efforts and of getting to a unified approach is accentuated, it's made even higher by the fact that we have adopted some segregation of roles for very deliberate and enduring reasons. Right? We want NASA to have a separate identity and ethos than the Department of Defense and the intelligence community, because it enables us to cooperate even with adversaries. Right? We did Apollo-Soyuz. We brought cosmonauts on the space shuttle. We collaborated with Mir, and now we have the International Space Station. And there's value to those things, even when you're dealing with a potential adversary. That's much harder for the defense establishment to do, and very, very hard for the intelligence community. So you don't want to lose that, I don't think. Right. So that adds your degree of difficulty. Similarly, on the commercial side, right, we've lodged historically licensing for commercial remote sensing with the Department of Commerce through the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. I actually have the opportunity to serve on the advisory committee to NOAA for commercial remote sensing. But it was put there because you wanted a counter pressure to the Department of Defense, which would have been naturally inclined to say, heck no, to any civilian space sensing, because it could reveal their operations. And you know, the current administration has been pushing for a much more permissive licensing environment and has now released regulations to do exactly that, that are responding to this democratization of space, right? The restrictive approach was clearly outmoded. But if you put the Space Force in charge of licensing, you know, commercial space activity, they probably would come to a different answer than the Department of Commerce. So we want unity of effort here. We want a national strategy, you know, there's more than just a few pages of document that sits in the interagency process. We need a national strategy. We want a national strategy. That's critical to competition in a, you know, an increasingly competitive world. But you got to acknowledge you've got these different organizations that do different things for real reasons, many of which don't go away, even in that environment.
That makes a lot of sense.
And to be clear, I'm not suggesting that we have everything just being unified as a one effort. The approach I was saying is that we need to break down some of the silos, and the fixation on the interagency process as being the thing itself. And I think what you're seeing is, as you rightly note, there are reasons for the segregation and separation of roles and responsibilities and whatnot. But the problem is those silos have gotten to the point where they've almost become obstacles to the efficient operation and treating space.
You're right. Domain. The good news, Josh, is if you land a really high degree of difficulty dive with a tiny splash, you're going to win the gold medal. So keep pushing.
True. So I think probably the last question go to you, Karen. So Space Force is focused on space as a warfighting domain. What specific things, though, can the U.S. be doing now to advance the whole of nation solutions that Josh was mentioning earlier?
Ooh, that's a toughie. Especially since I haven't seen episode 4 of Space Force yet. So, so the whole of nations approach, I think we just have to, I may defer to Jamie on this one, actually. Yeah. But I would say that we need certainly we need a good platform for international cooperation with our partners, and we need to be smart with partnering and combine our strengths so that we can achieve our space goals in a way that's efficient and cooperative and in a trustworthy way. So I think international partnerships will be key, especially as we're facing a potential fiscal cliff, and we need to do more with less.
Yeah. Jamie?
Yeah, I mean, having been involved in the stand-up of what we called at the time the Joint Interagency Combined Space Operations Center, now the National Space Defense Center, and looking at how to bring in allies to sensitive activities, to get to a combined space situational awareness or space domain awareness environment where we're taking advantage of the fact that, you know, there's partner countries on the other side of the world who have sensors that are really useful to us, but are, you know, not 100% controlled and trusted by us. But gosh, that doesn't mean that it can't be really helpful. These are things that have to be worked out in the detail, and a lot of our allies, first, there's almost universal appreciation for the efforts to pull them in, but there's also sometimes a sense of a say-do gap. That we publish strategies saying the support of the allies, the partnership is critical, and it's a priority. And then things move very slowly. Security architecture discussions take years. Systems interface architecture discussions take years. And there's lots of meetings without as much substance as people would like. By the way, this is on all sides of the relationship, right? All these governments have regulations and bureaucracies that are slow to change in this environment. It's to again plug our webinar tomorrow with General Bolden. One of the things he emphasized is constancy of purpose. Stuff in space, even with everything we're trying to do to accelerate, takes time. And rapid gyration of the rudder results in very inefficient path to your target. And so, you know, if we decide we're going to de-emphasize partnership for a year, we might lose 5 or 8 years or 10 years of progress on it, because it takes that sustained focus.
And I think we have to end there, so we're out of time. Thank you so much to Karen, Jamie, Joshua for being here with us today. Thank you to the Aerospace Corporation for partnering with us at NSI. If you'd like what you see, join us for our next episode. We have a lot more coming up. Follow us on Twitter at MasonNatSec. And with that, thank you all so much. Everyone,
thanks for hosting. It's a pleasure.
Thank you.